Good morning, all. Thanks for joining us as we host our webinar today on advancing eClinical interoperability. We're thrilled to have you join us today as we explore the critical role of interoperability in enhancing clinical data exchange and trial outcomes. Before we jump into our topics today, to cover a couple of housekeeping items, we encourage all of your participation, and you can feel free to submit your questions using the chat feature located at the top right of the screen. We'll have some dedicated time for question and answer at the end of the webinar, but you can submit your questions throughout the entirety of the session. Today's session will cover key topics including the current state of eClinical interoperability, challenges that are present in the industry today, as well as innovative solutions that are paving the way for seamless data sharing. With that, I'll kick it over to our hosts today, Jay Smith, the head of product for Trial Interactive, and Sina Adibi, the CEO and president of Adaptive Clinical Systems.
Thank you, Jake.
Thanks, Jake. Hi, everybody. Yeah, well, let's go ahead and get started. Jake, go to the next slide. My credibility on this particular topic of integration goes back a little ways. I wanted to share the fact that I was a developer for about 15 years, and one of the first things I ever worked on was an integration between a regulatory information management system and a eClinical system. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart, having been something that I worked on for quite some time. And so to answer the question, why integrate them, there's a couple of reasons here. The first is, let's make sure we have things like data integrity and master data management. Let's make sure that we're talking about the same things between our two systems. So for example, if I have a CTMS and I have an EDC solution, let's make sure that we've identified the same subjects and the same sites. And what a lot of folks do now is if they don't have time in the trial to integrate their systems, they will do double data entry across those systems. They will manually enter a lot of data in between these systems during the trial, because I think, as we all know, the trial and the time frame around the trial is paramount. That's the most important thing. So if there isn't time or budget to integrate these systems, there's going to be a lot of manual entry happening, a lot of duplication of effort. And with that, of course, comes a lot of human error. So a lot of human error is going to happen while you're trying to keep these systems up to date and relevant to each other. Also, when you have the trial in execution, there's a lot of data coming from the different systems. And so what a lot of these groups, like you might have ClinOps in one team, you might have a team with data management. These groups are sometimes in silos. And so having trial oversight really necessitates the ability to pull this data out into a common place where you have, again, master data management, data integrity, and one simple set of data that you can view and run metrics on. So this is another reason why it's a good idea to integrate. 98% of CROs right now, according to a recent Gartner paper, say that they must improve information sharing across partner platforms. 78% need to reduce manual processes. 61% say they want to speed trial and trial startup. 57% want to improve collaboration across the eClinical ecosystem. So there's just plenty of reasons. And that flexibility might be the last important point on this slide, which is, you'd like to have some kind of flexibility about what EDC solutions, for example, that you may want to use. Maybe a trial requires a typical EDC. Maybe another one requires, an eCOA system. And so having this kind of flexibility does require you to be able to integrate these systems quickly and easily. Otherwise, it's very difficult to use them. And there's options, of course, to platform and to, try to buy a platform that has all these capabilities. But, you'd like a little bit more flexibility than that. Sometimes, again, the platform may not have quite what you're looking for a particular trial or a particular product that you're trying to run through trials. So if you go to the next slide. There's a lot of obstacles that will prevent you from integrating these systems, and I think anyone that's tried this knows these obstacles pretty well. You've got some platforms that are built quite well with very, very good API integrations. Others not so good. Others maybe all you can get is a report, delivered out of that system maybe once a week, and that report you can't even confirm that it's not going to change in terms of its data point mappings and things like that. So it becomes very difficult sometimes to integrate those kinds of systems. You've got a lot of legacy and interfaces like that going on. Let's face it, if you're in a clinical team, sometimes it's hard to get access to IT resources. So it can be very challenging to get the right sort of folks that know how to do integrations, and know how to implement them quickly. And it is a very specialized thing, as I found out on my first project as a developer. It is a very specialized thing to be able to integrate systems well. And while you're doing that, you may have vendors out there that are SaaS vendors, cloud vendors per se, and so they do API maintenance pretty much constantly, and they're always doing upgrades. And you don't always have control of those upgrade schedules. So it can make it very difficult to maintain these interfaces in a validated state, which, as we all know, is an essential part of clinical trials, is to be able to stay GCP compliant and be able to stay Part 11 compliant and keep everything in a validated state. So all of these things are obstacles to integration for sure. Go to the next slide.
Okay. Yeah, Jay, first, let me thank you and Jake for letting us participate in this webinar. And we're really honored to have been selected as your partner for Trial Interactive Interoperability. You made a lot of good points there. And this is a depiction of why we're here. I'm pretty positive that just about everybody in the audience is familiar with what you see in the far left. We have fragmentation. Every day there is a new component or a new silo, as you call them, Jay, emerges. Just to give you some idea, a typical site has to use 7 different software tools to get their job done. And in total, you're talking about 30 different software platforms or these silos before the data is ready for submission. So you're talking about quite a bit of fragmentation. Now, in the gray, in the blue are the sources of data that we're very familiar with, like EDC and CTMS. In the gray, we see the new emerging categories like EMR. Jay, you mentioned uncooperative platforms. I like to point out that EMRs and digital health tech both are brand new emerging categories of data sources, and they both were, let's say, evolved in a different universe than ours. So a lot of time, the validation that you pointed out is a problem there. They don't comply with any of the standards that we know. They have their own standards, but none are compatible with ours. And then the other dimension of the data needs is in the middle, where the consumers of data have changed. Whereas data management was their stock and trade to deal with those, remember those Excel spreadsheet attachments to emails? And we kind of lived and survived with those for a long time. But now ClinOps, safety, IT, and many other groups within a CRO or a sponsor or the site want to have visibility to different slices of this data. So the challenge is not only how do you integrate the data, but how do you bring it together? How do you harmonize it? How do you make it uniformly available so that each one of these groups can see their own slice of the data? And we have been talking about risk-based monitoring for many years. We've been doing the SDTM standard for submission and so forth. These are all the different derivations, but the prerequisite for all of these, as Jay said, is to have a comprehensive integration and aggregation, and to be able to have a platform or the ability to keep putting these square pegs in round holes. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, Seen a quick comment on what you said. I like that you brought up HL7. I spent way too much time of my career working with HL7, 2.7 and 2.3 versions, which are these pipe and hat. They're just this
Yeah,
1982
yeah,
interface standards that we'd look at now, and we'd of course probably chuckle a little bit. But
mm,
fortunately, HL7 has come out with FHIR, FHIR, which is a
right.
decent standard. It's JSON based. It's pretty modern web services based. So I do have some hope for that. Hopefully that standard
Yeah,
can be helpful. But yeah, I hear you on the HL7 bit.
yeah. And thank you for bringing that up. And FDA was actually, oh gosh, their guidance for EMR integration and HL7 is about 10 years old now, almost. 2016 was when they had their industry sort of powwow where they invited a whole bunch of different vendors, including us, to comment on how can they get this data from the electronic medical records. So FDA definitely gets the benefits of it. The adoption, though, Jay, has been really slow. It's surprising. I mean, everybody sees the benefits of it, but we're so busy doing what we're doing that we can never kind of take a step back and say, okay, can we do this differently so that we can save time, as you pointed out, and make our work more efficient. But
Yeah,
yeah, I'm
hospitals.
definitely jazzed about that. Sure.
Yeah, hospitals have a challenge. Their IT staff is, relatively underfunded, I would say. They don't really have the money to, they're trying to, spend money on obviously new scanners and things like that. And so, they don't always have the ability to put it into the latest IT technology. So what I've seen happen is a lot of these hospitals are still integrating over VPNs, dropping HL7 2.7 version files onto SFTP sites to integrate. I mean, it's very very challenging to integrate with that. When here in pharma we have all these nifty IT capabilities, but healthcare is not that way.
I agree. I agree. And I think another aspect of it, to some extent, to defend them, not only they're shorthanded on the healthcare provision side, their priorities are different. First and foremost, they have to traffic data and the procedures that were done to the payers so that they can get compensated. And then at the same time, there is this huge pressure about privacy and security of healthcare data that is on their shoulders. So when we approach them from the pharma side and we try to make a case for why they should share the data with us, it's not first and foremost on their mind. That is changing, though. I think the sites are actually becoming a good sources of putting pressure on those hospital IT to open up their data silos. And I mean, ultimately, if the sites benefit, we benefit on the CRO and the sponsor side.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this slide is talking a little bit more about how should we look at an integration that works well. And so, Gartner has a strong opinion about it on this slide, and I think the next slide talking about how we should have a standard framework, how some of these integrations could be vendor maintained, which is something that is interesting because a lot of vendors out there put out their open APIs and they say, good luck, sponsor. Here's our APIs. Go ahead and integrate with these freely, which is fine, and it's great that they have the APIs. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, a lot of sponsors that are trying to get trials started have a lot of trouble getting IT folks in time to integrate against these open APIs. So, what Gartner suggests is that in many cases, it might be better if the vendors had the ability just kind of baked in to integrate with other platforms within their ecosystems, so that the folks on the sponsor side that are trying to get a trial done, they can just very easily pick which integration they want to choose. And they have configurable data mappings. They can go ahead and map it to their data set, and then maybe ideally it's reusable and serverless, flexible and adaptable, or all these great things that it could be.
Yep.
You can go to,
What?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to mention is you raised an interesting point in that one of the things we're finding is ultimately the sponsor is the beneficiary of this, right? So if the study is accelerated, if the quality is enhanced, and there's a lot of statistics that I'd like to share with you later. But what I'm seeing is we're seeing that a lot of sponsors, as part and parcel of their RFPs that they're putting out, they are requiring them to address the CROs or their partners to address integration, because they are now seeing the benefits, and they know that even though it's an additional step or two, like you said, that asking their bidders to adhere to frameworks or make sure that the data is integrated in a standard way ultimately benefits them. And this is a new trend that I would like to say I've begun to see in the last maybe 3 years, 2 years. Certainly with COVID, when we realized that our traditional practices just no longer worked, everybody took a step back, scratched their heads, and said, like, is there a better way to gather and collect our data and standardize it?
Yeah, that's a great place. I agree with that statement. Just in the last 3 years, we've had customers come to us expecting single sign-on integrations, as an example. Like, of course you
Yeah.
can do this.
Hmm.
And one of the great things about single sign-on is there's a very, very good standard that was built quite a few years ago called SAML 2.0 that pretty much everybody now supports. So that's a great example of how a standard can kind of make it so that this stuff is just ordering things off the shelf, where you can just, yeah, sure, you can have single sign-on into your system. And we're starting to see it with other. There's a few others that are based around user authentication, where that's becoming a little bit more of a standard. But of course, when it comes to clinical data standards, we have ODM. But when it comes to some of the things that we're talking about in terms of operational clinical data, we still don't have anything there yet.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was at a conference, actually it was last year, and we had a major pharma was talking about where all of their data comes from, the data that they want tied together. And they said that 70% of their data that is pertinent comes outside of EDC. So our traditional approach that EDC was the focal point for everything, and then from there we came out with the derivations, is no longer holding true. 70%, that's huge. You're talking about all of the digital health technologies with DCTs, you're talking about ePro and so on. So when we want to directly reach out. So yeah, definitely looking for really broad-based standards. And it's really hard because the nature of this 70% data is so different than ODM can handle in clinical, that you kind of want to make sure that you always have that intermediary transformation step that you can easily use.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best examples of that 70%, and that's a great statistic, is of course clinical documentation, into the eTMF, which we'll get into in
Yeah,
a little
yeah,
bit. But
uh-huh.
that documentation, there's no way to send it in. I'll tell you the best way that people integrate it now is over email. That's their integration. They send it over an email.
Oh, I know, I know. Yeah, that's one of my missions. One of my missions in life, Jay, is to eliminate Excel spreadsheets attached to emails. I mean, it's so vulnerable. That whole data could be misdirected, So now you have privacy issues. It could be out of sequence, it could be corrupted, and you don't know it. And then Excel itself was never made to be a conveyor of large volumes of data. So it tries to be clever sometimes, and it plays havoc with things like date of birth and so on. So there's like
Yeah.
countless reasons why you really should not do Excel or comma delimited files, because foreign languages you can't include in things like that, and you're at the mercy of the person who was typing the data and so forth. So yeah, I think we're making headway, though. I really do. I think the fewer hands that touch the data, it's intuitive, that quality is going to be better, speed is going to improve.
Yep. Go to the next slide, Jake. Yeah, so this a little bit more about best practice is also from the Gartner paper, talking about this concept of composability and modularity. So back in the 80s, Steve Jobs at Apple came out with a standard for hardware interoperability called Bonjour. And it was essentially a way for printers to talk to computers where the computer would say, "Who are you?" And the printer would answer back in Bonjour, "Oh, I'm a printer XYZ." And then the computer would say, "Great, I'm going to configure your drivers and make sure I can talk to you." And everyone knows, we have that now. We've been using it for decades, and it's great. And that concept is called a composable interface, where there's this dynamic adjustment of calls so that you can find out what's available, what resources are available to you from the other integrating party, and then based on that response, you can say, "All right, I'm going to integrate with you like this," and so that's what's really cool about that. And standards again pave the way for this. Bonjour is a standard that Apple made a long, long time ago, but standards provide a way for us to to get a common understanding of what does a clinical site look like, what does a document look like, what does a study look like, what does a patient or a participant look like. This is the kind of information that if we had a standard around that, we could definitely make some headway. But even if we don't have a standard, having this concept of a composable integration really can make it a lot easier for these systems to interact.
Yeah, definitely one size does not fit all. Jay, just 1 second. I was thinking we have a really cool poll that we wanted to ask our audience to share their experiences with us. What do you say we do that first poll, Jake, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, we covered a lot of ground. I would love to hear from the audience as to what is the challenge that they're facing. So yeah, feel free to click. Jake's going to give you a few minutes to catch up.
So far, I'm seeing everything.
I know. You know what's? Yeah, I'm just trying to sort of guess at the composition of what our audience do. All right, let's get. It says 50% voted. Perfect. All right. What do you think, Jay?
I think it's fascinating, and it doesn't surprise me that we have an eTMF centric audience, since we
Yeah.
are talking about eTMF here. But yeah, look at all these other systems too. People are worried about EHRs, they're worried about EDCs, CTMSs, medical devices. They're worried about everything.
Yeah. Yeah. To go to that composable things, if you look at this thing, you need to have a configurable way because each use case is different. Like, the way you would want to tie EDC data together or EHR data is going to be different than CTMS, different than eTMF, and so on. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think having that capability of not having to hardwire things and have it in a way that it is malleable enough for you to shift and move. I think definitely is something that should be part of the overarching solution.
Yeah, and there's a concept out there called MOC. It stands for microservices, API first, cloud native, and headless, as kind of the standard for composability. And you've probably seen this standard, in your normal, day to day, where suddenly like PayPal just instantly comes up and integrates with Facebook and things like that. It's like these are the way these
Yeah.
connectors, if you like, are integrated using this basic concept. And it really does pave the way for the right approaches if we're doing these kinds of clinical integrations.
Yep. Yep. FinTech has always been ahead of us. We
Yeah,
definitely, as an industry, are a laggard when it comes to adopting these capabilities. But yeah, and again, fair point is we're so heavily regulated, and financial tech is super critical. They can't make errors, but we really can't make any mistakes or errors. So
yeah,
not surprising that we're slower or more conservative, let's say, in adopting things. But I think time has come.
yeah, agree. All right, next slide.
Okay. Um, so we talked about a bunch of stuff here. One was the points that I want to make here is why this sort of approach of an middleware, let's call it. Um, each use case is different. When you're talking about EMR to EDC, you are probably most likely interested in things like medical history, demographics, our typical clinical data. But when you're talking about CTMS, or let's say a perfect use case for that is, as Jay mentioned, CRO oversight. You have multiple CROs, functional service providers, you got labs, and you want all of that aggregated in Trial Interactive. That's a completely different use case. You're talking about actually really wanting to read more the metadata, the information, the status information, rather than the actual clinical data. You're interested in payments, which is something that EDCs traditionally don't concern themselves with, but that's a key ingredient when you're talking about CTMS integration. And then with EMRs to EDC, one advice I give people is make sure that in your connectors, which are those sort of squares that you see in the periphery of the middleware, that you have connectors that are capable of managing natural language parsing, because there is a lot of valuable information in the physician notes. In as much as the Healthcare IT Act has been in effect for many, many years now, physicians still don't like structured data entry. So they put a lot of very valuable information in the physician notes section. A lot of the labs generate PDFs that get attached to the record in the EMR. So you need to make sure you have connectors for natural language and parsing and tokenization. The other thing that you want to do is you want to think about an approach where you separate what I call clinical logic from the actual underlying information. So the way you get protocol, to take sort of a CRO oversight example that we just recently did, um, the way you get protocol deviation reports from one major CRO is different than the way you get it from another CRO. So the underlying logic has to be different for each one of those sources. So you want to be able to control the way you manipulate and transform the data based on where it's coming from and where it's going to. You should always assume that there's going to be some form of a transformation. Um, Jay, I'm sure you've been listening to all of this AI um, thing that is going on, and there are a lot of companies that proclaim to have some super smart engine that can parse out any sort of data and figure out where it's going. The problem with that is they're at the mercy of the quality of that data. So if the data or the so-called training matter is not consistent or harmonized, then these AI algorithms go awry. And you will soon find out that if you start with poorly curated data, you feed it into an AI engine, you end up doing the cleanup a lot more than you used to do. Jay mentioned software as a service. Really, no one wants to install software anymore. You've got security privacy considerations. Your chief security officer will probably go bananas if you go and say, hey, listen, I want to install this software package here. So the smaller footprint is better on the IT side. And the bad news is that integration and interoperability, unfortunately, is not get it done and forget about it. Data, by definition, changes over time. So a pipe that worked perfectly for 6 months, if it's not closely monitored and looked after with appropriate indicators. This is not KPIs for performance of studies. This is things like, okay, I got 50,000 transactions. Of these 50,000 transactions, 10 of them were malformed, and those 10 malformed one, what were they? Where did they come from? Why did they happen the way that they did? These things will happen 3 months, 6 months, a year out, and our studies are all got long tails. So you want to make sure that you're continually watching these pipes and these feeds. So it's important to make sure that, again, in summary, you want to separate out the clinical logic from the actual API or the manner with which the data comes in. You want to minimize the IT footprint. You want to make sure that you know that each study is different. You want to have a framework where you can easily adapt. Jay talked about those reusable components. You want to make sure that you have a framework where you can reassemble components that you've already worked on before and validated. And finally, of course, it has to be in compliance with all the regs, CFR 21 Part 11, carefully defining and capturing exactly the lineage of every data element that was pushed into the target, where it came from, at what time, and so on. So those are really critical. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, pardon me, there is a solution. It is a something that does require some preparatory work and thought to be given to it, but that's the kind of solution that obviously we advocate here. One of the things I'd like to do when we move on from here is we have another poll that I would like Jake to put up before we go to the next slide. So we talked about all of the challenges. We talked about why. Hopefully everybody agrees. And so we want to now hear from you. Okay, so let's say you wave the magic wand and you've got everything interconnected, or things that matter you have interconnected. What are the benefits that you would expect? We probably don't have any site managers in the audience.
I was thinking the exact same thing, Sina.
Yeah, I can tell you that the composition of the audience are data managers and cleanups.
Mhm. Yeah, that poor CRC is out there making triple copies of
That's right.
the
That's right.
e-consent
That's
forms.
right. Yeah. Yeah. I actually want to, while we're doing this real quick, I want to share this. We did a project, a research project with Optum, where we integrated a whole bunch of different systems. And Optum's digital research network basically is a network of sites. And one of the objectives was to see if it was a bona fide study. It was a type 2 diabetes study, but a big part of the data collection was metrics of how efficient the sites became. And they eliminated source data verification, and they basically estimated that that was about 30% of the budget allocation essentially went away. So you're talking about huge, huge savings there for the site. So even though I'm willing to bet it's because we don't have sites here, don't overlook if you're a CRO or if you're a sponsor. Always remember that we all have this huge dependency on the sites. Um, the site's confidence in the quality of the data once they saw how everything was automatic was 83%. And they estimated that their labor savings, so like you said, the CRA, somewhere around 50 to 75% of their workload. If you contrast that with unfortunate statistic of 55%, from what I understand, of investigators do one study and they never come back. And the reason for it is because everything is so uncomfortable for them, and they have to go through this crazy data entry and re-entry, of course, among other things. So it's intuitive that if you do focus your attention on the sites, we're going to continue to have investigators that want to work with us, and we're going to have happier sites, and we're going to have quicker studies.
Yeah, Sina, we did a site management focus group last year. And just try to understand what are all the challenges happening at the site. There's a case where, like, a lot of times it's really hard for sites to hold on to clinical research coordinators because they take these jobs expecting to do clinical research, and they end up really just doing secretary and administrative work for most of it, and most of it is just data entry, making copies, things like that. It's not what really they signed up for,
Yeah. And then with DCTs, the more we push the data collection directly to the patient, that sin, if you will, becomes even
Yeah,
worse.
yep,
Because now the single most important actor in our study, being the patient that you want to make sure you retain, is the one that is having to deal with, get up at 10 a.m., make sure you have the app running, and make sure you have your laptop fired up, and make sure you're logged into this before you can turn on your monitoring devices and so on. I don't think
yep.
integration is going to address all of these problems, but I think it essentially really will take the edge off of it.
Hmm.
Jake, I'm sorry.
Agreed.
Is there any chance you can bring up the results? I was talking so much I didn't look at the results. Jay, did you catch the results? Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. I thought
So
it was interesting.
data quality and optimized data management. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. Well, that data quality in itself is huge. Thank you very much,
that's
Jake.
huge.
You can go on to the next slide.
Yeah, so this is kind of a depiction of the way, a system can work, as far as, we're going to focus a little bit more on the eTMF here. So we have content systems on the right there, systems like the eTMF, the EISF, your EDMS, or your training systems, and then you got your data systems on the left. And what's critical here is that these interconnects work, either between your content systems and your CTMS, or your EDC and randomization IRT systems and your CTMS. so that the CTMS becomes, the single source of truth for a lot of this operational data, and it can send the data down to the eTMF systems. And so the reason why this is really important is if you want to classify a document, let's suppose I send, I'm a site and I send the sponsor a document. The easy part is I put it in quotes, is to classify that document as a particular thing, like a 1572. But the hard part is to know that, okay, these are the clinical sites that 5072 is essentially about. Here are the contacts, the practitioners that it's also about. And then there's this other one that a lot of people don't know about, which is, how do I know that your practitioners are my practitioners? How do I know that John Smith in my system is the same John Smith that you have in your system? And that turns out to be harder than you would think. And so this data model mapping, where we've uniquely identified sites and contacts and studies, that turns out to be the most important thing if you want to be able to classify eTMF documents correctly across systems. You can go to the next slide unless you've. And so let's talk about the eTMF a little bit more. My last two slides are about the eTMF. So, you've got a lot of business goals for your eTMF. It's got to be timely, complete, contemporaneous. You have to have high quality. It has to be what we call healthy, which means that we know exactly what's supposed to be in it, and we have all of that data, and that data is correct. So that's really the idea behind your business goals for your eTMF. So this is where all your interconnects kind of impact that. The first thing is, what about your data flows, as I just mentioned? What about the data flows between the EDC, the IRT, the RBQM, the CTMS? How do I make sure that I have an equivalent understanding of all of those sites and contacts and studies and visits and things like that? And additionally, is the eTMF trial aware? Does it know, for example, that the study is in maintenance mode? Does it know that a visit has completed? Is it aware of all these events, that are happening, milestones that, is it last patient in, all these milestones and events that are constantly happening to the EDC and the CTMS? Is the TMF aware of this, the trial master file aware? So it can make sure that it has the right set of required documents and placeholders. And it can also make sure that it's asking for the right things and measuring health and completeness correctly. So that's the big thing, is it aware of the rest of the clinical trial? The second part is, of course, even harder. That's the ecosystem. Is it aware of the sites and the organizations that sit out there across the world? Third parties, vendors. These business arrangements are constantly changing and shifting. Is it aware that, for example, there is a site out there and there's an IRB that site is sending documents to, and the IRB is sending acknowledgments and approvals? Is it aware in getting all of that information back into the eTMF so that it can mark those documents correctly? And again, the simplest use case, which turns out to be the hardest one, can I send the eTMF a document and have the eTMF know exactly what it is? That is the hardest thing, because I need to be aware of all of those other things in order to be able to classify that document correctly in eTMF.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, last but not least, if you're a sponsor, you probably have a lot of other systems out there. You've got, your regulatory information management system. You've got your manufacturing systems, your quality systems. You may send your clinical deviations through your quality system. Maybe that's how you decided to do it. And so the TMF has to be aware of all of this information too, and that when I send from one of these other repositories to the TMF in the archive, the TMF can classify that document correctly. So it's a real tall order to get to that nice little chart I have in the middle there that says 40% complete. Here are the documents that are correct. Here are the ones that are missing. Here are the ones that are overdue. Sounds easy, but it's actually quite difficult to do that. Now, if you go to the next slide, this kind of drills in a little bit more to all of the integration points that I mentioned, a few of them during the course of the trial, so just as examples, right? You've got your protocol creation that occurs. Your plans are starting to be written. That's all during your study start phase. And all of that information, again, would be great to be able to send over to the eTMF, so the eTMF is aware, oh, I should expect these plans from these people, and now I know I can maybe even query or prompt them for those plans if they're not complete. So those are great examples. And of course, as we all know, throughout the trial, the protocols are always being revised. And when a protocol is revised, it's everyone's favorite thing, because now it has to be sent out to all of the sites, and everyone has to approve that protocol revision. You have to make a copy of it. You have to have the changes tracked. It has to be pushed and published and pushed in your EDC system, so that all the sites now have the latest and greatest eCRF. So all of this is very complex, and amendment management is truly one of the fun things, I have to say. But once you
Yeah.
get beyond that, you get into site startup. Go ahead, Sina. Sorry.
No. I just, you are so right. These protocol amendments, I mean, our studies, I don't want to say we had it easy before, but, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was a single treatment. We were trying to figure out one thing, one biomarker. Now they're so complex that as the study progresses, we learn more. So protocol amendments is something that means suddenly you have to capture new information. Now new reports need to be generated, and previous reports need to be amended. You're absolutely right. We can't do this manually anymore. We just can't. It has to be
Yeah.
automated.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not even bringing up all the training that has to happen on that new protocol, right?
Oh
So
God,
all
yeah.
the training, and then the learning management system has to make sure the eTMF is aware of all of those course completions, and the CTMS should be aware of that too. So it gets quite complicated, and a lot of this is a management challenge. It's easy to do this in paper maybe, but when you have to do it constantly, it's not easy anymore. Site startup, I think everybody knows the complexity around that one. So now you have to send out not just to the sites and the IRBs, but to the regulatory agencies, often to the regions. There's so many things that have to happen correctly in order to get that site startup. So complex, in fact, that we have specialized products like study startup, and specialized roles like a study startup, professional that basically know how to do this across the world. So all of those things need to go into the eTMF, so the eTMF knows what to capture and what to expect. Maybe the simplest thing is the mid-trial updates. So that's, I've got a new visit. I'm expecting 2 letters. I'm expecting a report. Those are the kinds of things that the TMF needs to expect and know, that it shouldn't count against my eTMF health if the visit didn't happen, for example. And then, of course, there's many other milestones that are happening during, things like closeout, where DB lock is happening, and you have to archive a great deal of information at that stage. And so, all of the things over on the right side, you can see all the integration points I've listed out there. It's really just an astonishing amount of information that needs to be updated in the system to keep it the eTMF truly healthy. Um, so very, very fun to think about.
Right. The only thing I want to add here is, I certainly hope that folks in the audience are not kind of intimidated by saying, "Oh my God, this is like such a mammoth task. I have to, where am I? I have to now corral 50 different departments within our organization, and now I have to talk to the right people at the CRO and the vendor." Um, just like any other project, you definitely don't boil the ocean. Don't. Jay mentioned that a few times, that it's hard. it is hard, but what I recommend is for folks who are beside themselves with one aspect of the study execution, and that varies from organization to organization. You may be shorthanded in ClinOps, you might be shorthanded in data management, in biometrics. Um, Focus on, okay, how can I introduce efficiencies through integration? And know that you can phase things. You can address the low hanging fruit, then you come back and then you add more and more and more. The integration project failures that I have seen was when an organization went after literally like every aspect of integration. Every department within the organization wanted the efficiencies, and that's when you've got so much work to do and so many moving parts that you can never get done. So if I were to say, don't be intimidated by all of the different components that we mentioned here. Know that start with your biggest pain point, go after that, but choose tools that allow you to build on top of it. Okay. And I would say, if I were to give any advice to anyone who's thinking about this or has perhaps tried it and have been unsuccessful, is don't lose heart. There definitely is huge benefits to be had from like fully integrating everything.
Yeah, the dip your toe in the water approach definitely is the right one, Sina. What I've seen with our customers is, when speaking of the slide here where we have all these eTMF integration points trying to keep the eTMF healthy, a lot of folks will start out with some very basic things first. They'll start out with their green light list for the site, right? Let's get that in there. And we know that the site is active. And once we know the site is active, we can activate it in the eTMF. And then suddenly all these placeholders are available to be filled out. And now the TMF folks know exactly what to collect. And then as you build that out, you try, hey, let's try this milestone. Let's add that milestone. There's just so many things that you can do to just go slow and slowly adopt some of these key integrations for sure.
Okay. So we got like 7 minutes, Jay. Are you done? I'm sorry. I think this is the
Yeah,
last slide,
yeah,
right? Yeah. Maybe
yeah.
we'll let the audience ask any questions that they might have. Hopefully we triggered some thoughts there. Jake, do we have any questions from folks?
Yes, sir. We can jump in. As you mentioned, 7 minutes left. I think we have time for one or two questions. The first being, with the rise of decentralized clinical trials and remote monitoring technologies, how important is interoperability in ensuring a cohesive data flow across platforms and ensuring compliance?
Wow. Okay. Jay, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a mouthful for sure. But I think what it's talking about is how, you know, in the absence of clinical sites, where we may have one site or we may have fewer sites, and we're doing everything direct to the participant. How are we going to manage all this? And I would say that for those kinds of trials, you're going to want to integrate almost as a necessity, because those kinds of trials require just a much higher level of collaboration between clinical operations and data management. And quite frankly, a lot of them do have a lot of the vendors that do those kinds of systems, they do have an integrated system for you, but you can go ahead and do an integration to the systems that you choose to use. But I would say it's essential if you really want to roll out with those kinds of approaches.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that if you have attended any of these conferences, we've been talking about the 5 V's of data: uh, volume, velocity, veracity, variety, and the value of the data. Those are, I think, I got the five. Um, the in DCTs, for the person who asked this question, what we've done a fine job of aggravating is volume and velocity. Clearly, think of it as a patient monitoring tool is transmitting a significant AE or an SAE. You really have to be able to intercept that and catch that. So you really can't rely on our antiquated manual approaches where, okay, the device is downloading the stuff into a Excel spreadsheet and the vendor will periodically send it over. No, you really need to see that pop up immediately so that you can address it. And then the other thing that has happened with remote monitoring is there's just too much data that is not relevant. So you really want to make sure that middleware that I talked about and Jay talked about, where you're filtering the data, that's going to be critical. However, you have an archiving obligation. So if the EKG is sending the biometric the telemetry, you have an obligation to keep all of that, but really all you need for the study is maybe the outliers. So all of these considerations, you just can't do this stuff manually anymore. There are some DCT vendors, happen to be also partners of ours. They generate huge volumes of data and they do a good job of that. But then that data is sort of needs to be filtered and processed for use for further down the chain, culminating in the eTMF that Jay talked about and the CTMS for status information. So yeah, I think if anything, begin to integrate stuff and automate. We just can't go hiring people anymore. The volume of data is so great now.
Yeah, and I would say, maybe in closing, since I think that's the only question, right, Jake? In closing, there's a lot of really interesting future technologies that we can look at. I would say maybe the most important one for this space is standardization, which is a very old kind of technology.
Yeah,
That's where we just agree on these are the things that we're going to trade back and forth, and that's going to simplify just about anything else that we do. We can talk about machine learning, for a long time about how great it is, but the machines, just like humans, they need standards to work from.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I think we could fill up a whole hour webinar on just the applications of data integration for AI and those algorithmic approaches. But you're right. Yeah, thank you very much, Jay, for having me here. It was a real pleasure to share some of our thoughts with you.
Yeah, thank you, Jake.
Yep. Thank you, both of our speakers, Jay, Sina. To all of our listeners, thanks for tuning in today. Hopefully, you had your questions answered. You can follow our speakers on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions that you feel weren't answered, you'd just like to learn more about something that you heard today, feel free to reach out to either info@trialinteractive.com or info@adaptive-clinical.com. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.